The howling wind whipped snow across the desolate mountain pass as Victoria Matthews staggered through knee-deep drifts, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping a broken lantern that had long since extinguished. Her scream pierced the frigid December air as another contraction seized her body, forcing her to double over against the gnarled trunk of a pine tree, the bark rough beneath her frost-bitten fingers. The year was 1878, and Victoria's journey west had ended far differently than she had imagined when she'd fled Philadelphia 3 months earlier. At 22, she'd been naive enough to believe Thomas Bennett's promises of marriage and a new life in Colorado's mining country. His letters had painted Pueblo as a land of opportunity, where they would build their future together after she arrived. But when Victoria stepped off the train, travel-weary and 5 months with child, Thomas was nowhere to be found. The cruel truth had come days later. He had taken a mining company's advance payment and fled to California, leaving Victoria alone, pregnant, and destitute in a town where she knew no one. Victoria had managed to find work as a seamstress for the past 4 months, renting a tiny room above the general store, but when her landlord discovered her condition, he'd given her until the end of the month to leave. No one wanted an unwed mother under their roof, regardless of how skilled her needlework. With December's arrival bringing the first heavy snows, Victoria had made a desperate decision to travel to the next town over, where she'd heard a widowed doctor might be willing to help her in exchange for housekeeping. The journey should have taken a single day by wagon, but the driver she'd hired had abandoned her halfway when the snowstorm hit, claiming he wouldn't risk his horses. Taking only her small bag of possessions, Victoria had continued on foot, convinced she could make it to shelter before nightfall. Now, as darkness enveloped the mountainside and her labor intensified, she knew she had made a fatal miscalculation. "Please," she whispered through cracked lips, her breath crystallizing in the air before her. "Please, not here, not now." But her unborn child paid no heed to her pleas. Another contraction ripped through her body, longer and more powerful than the last, bringing Victoria to her knees in the snow. Her scream echoed across the valley as she desperately looked around for any sign of shelter. Through the swirling white, she spotted what appeared to be a shallow overhang in the rocky mountainside, perhaps 30 yards ahead. Summoning her remaining strength, Victoria pushed herself upright and staggered toward it, each step agony as the contractions grew closer together. The small cave was barely deep enough to shield her from the driving snow, but it was the only refuge available. Victoria collapsed inside, her back against the cold stone wall, as she fumbled to remove her sodden cloak and spread it beneath her. Her fingers, nearly numb with cold, worked at the buttons of her dress, exposing her legs to the bitter air as she prepared for what seemed inevitable. She would deliver this child alone, miles from help, in the middle of a blizzard. As another contraction seized her, Victoria's scream tore through the night, carrying across the valley below. Half a mile away, Hank Forrester sat beside a small fire in his modest cabin, nursing a cup of coffee laced with whiskey as he listened to the wind howl against the sturdy log walls. At 30 years old, Hank had spent most of his adult life in the saddle, working cattle drives across the territory, before finally settling on this small plot of land 2 years ago. It wasn't much, 40 acres with a small herd of cattle and 3 good horses, but it was his, paid for with years of hard work and careful saving. He'd built the cabin himself, positioned strategically on a bluff that overlooked the trail that wound through the valley between Pueblo and the smaller settlements to the west. It gave him a good view of anyone passing through, which was how he preferred it. Hank valued his solitude, Having seen enough of humanity during his years as a cowhand to know, he preferred the company of his animals and the occasional visit to town for supplies. The howling wind nearly drowned out the sound, but something made Hank pause with his cup halfway to his lips. He set it down and moved to the frost-covered window, wiping away the condensation with his sleeve. The storm outside had intensified, blanketing everything in white, but he was certain he'd heard something that didn't belong, something that wasn't the wind or the creaking of pine branches heavy with snow. He waited, ears straining, and then he heard it again, a high, pained cry that cut through the storm's fury. Someone was out there. Hank moved with practiced efficiency, pulling on his heavy sheepskin coat, fur-lined gloves, and hat. He grabbed his rifle from above the door more out of habit than any expectation of danger. After stoking the fire with extra logs, he opened the door and stepped into the blizzard's fury, his lantern held high as he called out, "Hello, anyone out there?" The wind snatched away his words, but Hank was already moving toward where he thought the sound had originated. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Buck, whinnied nervously in the small lean-to stable, but Hank knew taking the animal out in this weather would be foolish. This would have to be done on foot. He trudged through snow that reached halfway up his calves, the lantern's glow creating a small sphere of visibility in the swirling white. Twice he stopped, listening, before he heard it again, a woman's scream, weaker now, coming from the direction of the rocky outcroppings that lined the eastern edge of his property. Hank quickened his pace, his breath coming in heavy clouds as he pushed against the wind. The scream came again, and this time he recognized it for what it was: not just pain or fear, but the distinctive cry of a woman in labor. "Hold on," he shouted, though he doubted his voice carried. "I'm coming." It took him nearly 20 minutes of difficult hiking before he spotted the shallow cave and the huddled form within. His lantern illuminated a young woman, her face contorted in pain, her dress hiked up around her thighs as she lay half-reclined against the rock wall. Victoria's eyes, wild with pain and fear, met his, and for a moment she recoiled in terror at the bearded stranger looming in the cave entrance. "Don't be afraid," Hank said, setting down his rifle and approaching slowly, his voice gentle despite having to raise it above the storm. "I heard you from my cabin. I'm here to help." Her next contraction hit before she could respond, and Victoria's back arched as she cried out, her hands clawing at the stone beneath her. Hank knelt beside her, setting the lantern where its light would be most useful. He'd helped deliver calves and foals over the years, but never a human child. Still, he knew enough to recognize that this woman and her baby would die out here without his help. "My name's Hank Forrester," he said, removing his gloves and coat to wrap around her trembling form. "I've got a cabin not far from here, warm with a fire going." "Victoria," she gasped between contractions. "Victoria Matthews, I can't move. The baby's coming." Hank assessed the situation quickly. The woman was right, moving her now would be impossible. The baby would have to be delivered here, in this inadequate shelter, with a blizzard raging outside. "All right, Victoria," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "I'm going to help you bring this baby into the world, and then I'm going to get you both somewhere safe and warm. I need you to trust me." "Can you do that?" Victoria stared at him, this rugged stranger with kind eyes who had appeared out of nowhere like an answer to her desperate prayers. What choice did she have? "Yes," she whispered. "Good," Hank said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Now, when the next pain comes, I need you to push." Over the next hour, Hank guided Victoria through her labor with a calm steadiness that belied his own racing heart. He had never felt such responsibility pressing down on him, two lives literally in his hands. When the baby's head finally crowned, he talked her through the final, most painful pushes, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they guided the infant into the world. "It's a boy," Hank announced, his voice thick with emotion as the tiny, red-faced infant let out his first indignant wail. Using his hunting knife, Hank cut the cord and quickly wrapped the newborn in his own shirt, cleaning the baby's face and making sure his airways were clear. A strong boy. Victoria, exhausted beyond measure, reached for her son with trembling arms. As Hank placed the bundled infant against her chest, tears streamed down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Hank nodded, but his mind was already on their next challenge. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and despite his coat wrapped around her, Victoria was shivering uncontrollably. The afterbirth came quickly, and Hank knew they had precious little time before exposure claimed them all. "Victoria, we need to get to my cabin," he said firmly. "It's not far, but it's going to be a difficult journey. Can you stand if I help you?" she tried, but her legs buckled immediately, her face paling to an alarming shade of white. Hank made a quick decision. "I'm going to carry you both. I need you to hold the baby tight against you, inside my coat." Without waiting for a response, he gathered Victoria in his arms, cradling her and the newborn against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, despite her pregnancy, and Hank wondered how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. The journey back to the cabin was arduous. The snow had deepened, and Hank's muscles burned with the effort of carrying his precious cargo. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, but her arms remained firmly wrapped around her son. By the time they reached the cabin, Hank's shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the frigid air. He shouldered open the door, grateful he'd left the fire well stoked. The warmth hit them like a physical force as he carried Victoria to his bed. A simple but sturdy frame with a corn husk mattress covered in clean linens and thick wool blankets. "Stay with me, Victoria," he urged as he laid her gently on the bed, unwrapping his coat from around her to reveal the tiny infant still clutched protectively to her chest. "You're safe now. You're both safe." Victoria's eyes fluttered open, taking in the rustic cabin with its glowing fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and the tall, broad-shouldered man who had just saved her life. "My baby," she murmured. "Is he all right?" Hank gently examined the infant, who had fallen asleep against his mother's warmth. "He seems just fine," he assured her, "but you both need to get warm and dry." With practiced efficiency, Hank stoked the fire higher and put a pot of water on to heat. From a chest at the foot of the bed, he pulled out a clean flannel shirt. "It's all I have that might fit you," he explained, setting it beside her. "I'm going to step outside for a moment to fetch more wood. See if you can change into that. The baby can be wrapped in one of those blankets there." He turned to give her privacy, but Victoria's weak voice stopped him. "Please," she said. "I don't think I can manage on my own." Hank hesitated, his face flushing slightly beneath his beard. He was no stranger to women, but there was something different about Victoria, a vulnerability mixed with quiet strength that stirred unfamiliar protective instincts in him. "Of course," he said finally, turning back to help her. With as much delicacy as his calloused hands could manage, Hank helped Victoria out of her wet, bloodied clothes and into his flannel shirt. He tried to avert his eyes from her exposed skin, focusing instead on efficiency and her comfort. Together they cleaned and properly swaddled the newborn in a soft wool blanket. Once Victoria and the baby were settled comfortably in his bed, Hank heated some broth he'd made the day before and brought it to her in a mug. "Drink this," he encouraged. "You need to keep up your strength." Victoria accepted the mug gratefully, the warm broth bringing color back to her pale cheeks. As she sipped, She studied her rescuer more carefully. Hank Forrester was tall and broad-shouldered, with a full beard that couldn't quite hide his strong jaw. His hair, a dark brown that curled slightly where it touched his collar, was streaked with premature silver at the temples. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention, a clear, steady blue that reminded her of summer skies. "I don't know how to thank you," Victoria said softly, cradling her sleeping son in one arm while she held the mug with her other hand. "If you hadn't found us—" "No need for thanks," Hank interrupted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Victoria said with surprising firmness. "Not anyone. Most would have passed by, especially knowing." Her voice trailed off as she looked down at her ringless left hand. Hank followed her gaze and understood. An unwed mother was a social pariah in these parts, regardless of the circumstances. "Your situation is none of my business," he said quietly. "All that matters is that you and your boy are safe." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. It had been so long since anyone had shown her basic human kindness without judgment. "His name is Samuel," she said, looking down at her son's tiny face. "Samuel Matthews." Hank nodded, a small smile softening his weathered features. "That's a good, strong name." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft sound from the sleeping infant. Hank moved about the cabin, hanging Victoria's wet clothes to dry near the fire, preparing more food, and making a makeshift cradle for Samuel from a wooden box lined with soft blankets. As the night deepened and the storm continued to rage outside, Victoria found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. The warmth, the food in her stomach, and the overwhelming relief of safety made it impossible to resist the pull of exhaustion. "Sleep," Hank said, noticing her struggle. "You've been through more today than most people face in a lifetime. I'll keep watch over both of you." "Where will you sleep?" Victoria murmured, already half dreaming. "I've got my chair by the fire," Hank replied. "I've slept in far worse places." Victoria wanted to protest, to insist he take his own bed, but sleep claimed her before she could form the words. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Hank gently placing Samuel in his makeshift cradle, his large hands infinitely careful with the tiny life they held. For 3 days, the blizzard held them hostage in the small cabin. Hank ventured out only to tend to his animals in the nearby barn, always returning with frosted beard and eyebrows but fresh milk from his cow for Victoria. The enforced proximity created an unusual domesticity between them, as they cared for the newborn together and shared the simple tasks of cooking and keeping the fire fed. Victoria learned that Hank had been a cattle driver for most of his adult life, saving every penny until he could buy this small ranch 2 years ago. He'd fought briefly in the closing days of the Civil War as a young man, though he spoke little of that time. Now, at 30, he was respected in Pueblo as a fair man who kept to himself, but could be counted on in times of need. In turn, Hank learned of Victoria's journey west, of Thomas Bennett's betrayal, and of her desperate attempt to reach the neighboring town before her baby arrived. He listened without judgment, though Victoria noticed his jaw tighten when she spoke of Thomas. "What will you do when the weather clears?" Hank asked on the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat before the fire with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle. Victoria stared into the flames, the question she'd been avoiding now impossible to ignore. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no family, no money beyond a few dollars, and no prospects. The doctor I was traveling to see might still take me in, but—" "But you'd be little more than a servant," Hank finished for her. Understanding immediately, Victoria nodded, tears threatening. "I'll do whatever I must for Samuel. If that means working as a housekeeper or laundress or returning to seamstress work, so be it. At least in a new town, perhaps they won't know I'm unwed." Hank was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with more attention than the task required. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "You could stay here." Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Not permanently," Hank hastened to add, misreading her surprise as alarm. "Just until spring, when travel would be safer for you and the boy. I've got the space, and an extra pair of hands around the place would be welcome." "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition if you're earning your keep," Hank said reasonably. "I'm a fair hand at most things, but I'll admit cooking isn't my strong suit, and this place could use a woman's touch." He gestured at the Spartan cabin with its minimal furnishings and utilitarian organization. "In return, you and Samuel would have shelter, food, and time for you to recover your strength and make proper plans." Victoria studied him, searching for any hidden motive behind his offer, but found only sincerity in his steady gaze. It was a practical arrangement that would benefit them both, and yet, "People would talk," she said softly. "Your reputation," Hank's short laugh interrupted her. "My reputation can withstand a bit of gossip. I don't much care what people think, Victoria. Never have. Even so, I think on it," he said, rising from his chair. "There's no need to decide tonight. The storm won't let up for another day at least, according to my bones." He flexed his right hand, which Victoria had noticed sometimes troubled him in the cold. That night, as Victoria lay in Hank's bed with Samuel nestled beside her, she weighed her options carefully. The prospect of traveling further with a newborn in winter was daunting, even after the storm passed. And what awaited her? A position as an overworked housekeeper to a doctor she'd never met, who might withdraw his offer once he saw her circumstances. Here, at least, she knew what to expect. Hank had shown himself to be honorable, kind, and respectful of her boundaries. The cabin was small but sturdy, and with some effort could be made quite comfortable. Samuel would have space to grow, fresh air, and good food. By morning, Victoria had made her decision. When Hank returned from tending his animals, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the news that the storm was finally beginning to abate, she was ready. "I've decided to accept your offer," she said as he hung his coat by the door. "But I have conditions." Hank's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he nodded for her to continue. "First, I won't take your bed any longer. I can make a pallet for myself by the fire." "Not acceptable," Hank countered immediately. "You need proper rest to recover, and you need to be near the baby." "The bed is yours until we can arrange something better." Victoria frowned, but decided to let that battle wait for another day. "Second, I want to contribute fully, not just cooking and cleaning, but whatever work needs doing. I'm stronger than I look, and I learn quickly." Hank considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough, though you'll start light until you're fully recovered." "And third," Victoria said, her voice softening, "I want you to be honest with me always, as I will be with you, if at any point this arrangement becomes uncomfortable for either of us. We speak plainly about it." Hank held her gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Honesty I can promise. It's about the only thing of value I have to offer." With that simple exchange, their temporary partnership was formed. Neither could have anticipated how quickly it would evolve into something far more complicated. As December gave way to January, the rhythm of life in the small cabin settled into a comfortable pattern. Victoria regained her strength quickly, determined to prove her worth. Though Hank insisted she rest frequently, especially in those first weeks, she threw herself into making the cabin more livable. Her first project was sewing proper baby clothes for Samuel from fabric Hank had ridden into town to purchase once the trails were passable. Though the town was only 5 miles away, Hank had been reluctant to leave Victoria and the baby alone, even for the few hours the trip required. What if something happens? He'd fretted, checking his rifle and pistol for the third time before departing. Victoria had been touched by his concern but shooed him out the door with assurances she was perfectly capable of managing for an afternoon. In truth, she welcomed the brief solitude to gather her thoughts, which had been increasingly confused where Hank was concerned. Living in such close quarters, it was impossible not to develop a certain intimacy. They had quickly learned each other's habits and preferences, how Hank preferred his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, how Victoria hummed softly when concentrating on detailed work, how they both enjoyed quiet evenings by the fire rather than constant conversation. More unsettling were the moments of accidental physical contact that sent unexpected warmth through Victoria's body, their hands brushing as they passed dishes, Hank's steadying grip on her elbow when she carried water over icy ground, the way her heart raced when he leaned close to demonstrate how to properly chop kindling. It was foolish, she told herself firmly as she nursed Samuel that January afternoon. She had barely escaped disaster after trusting a man too quickly once before. She would not make the same mistake again, especially with her son's well-being at stake. This arrangement with Hank was practical, temporary, and nothing more. Yet when he returned that evening, his beard and eyebrows frosted with ice, but his arms laden with not just the requested fabric, but also a small rocking chair he'd bartered for in town, Victoria's resolve weakened. The chair was old and needed refinishing, but it was perfect for nursing Samuel by the fire. "I thought it might make things easier," Hank said gruffly, embarrassed by her evident delight. "The storekeeper's wife was getting rid of it, said her children are all grown now." Victoria ran her hand over the smooth, worn arms of the rocker, blinking back unexpected tears. "It's perfect, thank you." Later that night, as she sat in the chair with Samuel at her breast, Victoria noticed Hank watching them from across the room, a look of such longing on his face that it made her breath catch. When he realized she'd caught him staring, he quickly turned away, busying himself with mending a bridle that didn't need repair. The next morning brought the season's first true thaw, a brief respite from winter's grip that allowed them to work outside. Hank showed Victoria the small barn where he kept his milk cow, 2 workhorses, and his prized buckskin gelding, Buck. Victoria, who had grown up in the city, was initially nervous around the large animals but soon found herself enjoying the simple routine of feeding and grooming them. "You've got a natural way with animals," Hank observed as Victoria confidently led the gentle milk cow, Bessie, back to her stall after milking. "Most city folks are too hesitant, which makes the animals nervous." Victoria smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I think they sense when you're afraid," she replied. "I decided not to be afraid." Hank's laugh was warm and genuine. "If only it were that simple for the rest of us." "Isn't it?" Victoria challenged, emboldened by his good humor. "You decide what to feel and then you feel it." "That's how I've always managed." Hank studied her with new interest. "Is that how you survived being abandoned in a strange town about to give birth? You just decided not to be afraid." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "I decided to focus on what I could control, not on what I couldn't." Fear wouldn't have helped Samuel. Action was the only option. Hank nodded slowly, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You're a remarkable woman, Victoria Matthews." The simple statement, delivered without flattery or expectation, warmed Victoria more than elaborate compliments ever could. As January progressed, they settled into a comfortable division of labor. Hank handled the heavier outdoor work, chopping wood, caring for the animals and beginning preparations for spring planting while Victoria managed the domestic sphere. She discovered that she enjoyed cooking far more when she had someone appreciative to cook for, and Hank's enthusiastic reception of even her simplest meals was gratifying. In the evenings, they often sat by the fire, Victoria sewing or mending while Hank read aloud from one of his small collection of books. He favored adventure tales and history, but also owned volumes of poetry that surprised Victoria with their sensitivity. Samuel, growing stronger by the day, would lie on a blanket between them, kicking his legs and cooing at the sound of their voices. It was during one such evening, as January neared its end, that their careful balance shifted. Hank had been reading from Wordsworth, his deep voice giving weight to the poet's reflections on nature when he paused mid-verse. Victoria looked up from her mending to find him watching her, a curious expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Do I have flour on my face still?" She'd been baking bread that afternoon. "No," Hank said softly. "I was just thinking how different this place feels with you and Samuel here, how much warmer." Victoria's heart quickened at the simple honesty in his words. "It was plenty warm before we arrived," she said lightly, trying to deflect the sudden intensity of the moment. "You keep a good fire." "That's not the kind of warmth I mean." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Victoria felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing quietly beneath the surface of their practical arrangement. Samuel chose that moment to let out a demanding wail, breaking the tension. Victoria gathered him up gratefully, using the distraction of nursing him to gather her composure. Hank cleared his throat and returned to his book, but the words seemed to hover in the air between them for the rest of the evening. That night, lying in what she still thought of as Hank's bed despite his insistence that it was now hers, Victoria admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny. She was falling in love with Hank Forrester. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, it brought a sense of peace. Unlike Thomas, who had charmed her with grand promises and flattery, Hank had earned her trust through small, consistent acts of kindness and respect. The question that kept her awake into the small hours was whether he might feel the same, and if so, what it could mean for their future. February arrived with renewed snowfall, heavy and wet, that confined them to the cabin for days at a time. The enforced proximity only intensified Victoria's awareness of Hank, his scent of pine and leather, the way his voice deepened when he was tired, how his hands, so large and calloused, could be impossibly gentle with Samuel. For his part, Hank seemed increasingly torn between drawing closer to Victoria and maintaining a respectful distance. There were moments when his hand would reach for hers, only to withdraw at the last instant, or when his gaze would linger on her face until she blushed and looked away. Their unspoken feelings might have remained in this delicate balance indefinitely if not for Samuel's fever. It came on suddenly one night in mid-February. Victoria woke to find her son burning hot to the touch, his tiny face flushed as he wailed weakly. Terror seized her as she remembered the stories of infants lost to winter fevers. "Hank," she called, her voice tight with fear. "Something's wrong with Samuel." Hank was at her side instantly, moving from his pallet by the fire with a speed that suggested he hadn't been deeply asleep. One touch to Samuel's forehead confirmed Victoria's fears. "We need to cool him down," Hank said, his voice calm despite the worry in his eyes. "And we need the doctor from town." "But the snow, I'll make it through," Hank said with quiet determination, already pulling on his heavy boots. "Keep him cool with damp cloths. Not cold water, just cool, and try to get him to nurse if he will. The milk will help," Victoria nodded, fighting back tears as she clutched Samuel to her chest. "Please hurry." Hank paused at the door, his expression softening as he looked back at them. "I'll bring help, Victoria. I promise you that." The journey to town was treacherous, the trail obscured by fresh snow and the darkness broken only by Hank's lantern. Buck struggled in the deeper drifts, but Hank urged him on, knowing that every minute counted. It took nearly 2 hours to reach Pueblo, where most windows were dark in the pre-dawn hours. Dr. Martin Howard was understandably disgruntled at being pounded awake, but the mention of a fevered infant galvanized him to action. Within minutes, he was dressed and gathering supplies into his medical bag. "You say the child is how old?" he asked as he worked, his movements efficient despite his advanced age. "Just over 2 months," Hank replied. "Born during the December blizzard." The doctor's eyebrows rose. "And the mother?" Hank hesitated, protective of Victoria's privacy. "She's staying at my ranch until spring. Her name is Victoria Matthews." Dr. Howard nodded, asking no further questions, though his shrewd eyes suggested he had formed his own conclusions about their situation. The return journey was even more difficult, with the doctor's added weight and the morning light revealing just how treacherous the trail had become. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was well up, and Hank's anxiety for Samuel and Victoria had grown to nearly unbearable levels. Inside, they found Victoria pale with fear but dry-eyed and composed, following Hank's instructions faithfully. Samuel's fever had neither broken nor worsened, and he had nursed briefly before falling into a fitful sleep. Dr. Howard's examination was thorough but gentle. "It's an infection," he concluded at last, opening his bag to remove several small bottles. "Not uncommon in infants, especially in winter. Not dangerous if treated promptly, which we're doing." The relief that flooded through both Victoria and Hank was palpable, the tension that had held them rigid for hours finally easing. "You'll need to give him these drops every 4 hours, Doctor," Howard instructed, measuring a precise dosage into a small spoon and demonstrating how to administer it to the fussing infant. "Keep him warm but not overheated, and make sure he continues to nurse. His appetite may be poor, but fluids are essential." Victoria nodded, committing every instruction to memory. "And he'll recover completely, with proper care, yes," the doctor assured her. "He's a strong boy and he has a devoted mother." His eyes flicked briefly to Hank, standing protectively close to Victoria. "And father, it seems." Neither Victoria nor Hank corrected the assumption, though a flush crept up Victoria's neck. After the doctor had been fed a hasty breakfast and sent on his way with Hank's promise to check the trail for him in a few days, Victoria finally allowed herself to give in to the emotions she'd been suppressing. As Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle, the fever already responding to the medicine, she sank into the rocking chair and buried her face in her hands. Hank knelt before her immediately, his hands warm and steadying on her shoulders. "He's going to be fine, Victoria. You heard the doctor." "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. For a moment I thought I might lose him and I couldn't bear it." "You won't lose him," Hank said firmly. "Not while I have breath in my body to prevent it." Victoria looked up, startled by the fierce conviction in his voice. What she saw in his eyes made her breath catch, not just concern for Samuel, but a depth of feeling for her that couldn't be mistaken. "Hank," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say, but knowing something needed to be acknowledged between them. "I shouldn't speak," he interrupted, his hands dropping from her shoulders as he stood and moved away. "You're vulnerable right now, worried for your son. It wouldn't be right." Victoria rose from the rocking chair, crossing the small space to stand before him. "Speak about what?" She pressed, unwilling to let this moment slip away like so many others. Hank met her gaze directly, his expression both tender and troubled. "About how I feel when I look at you. About how these past 2 months have shown me what I've been missing in my life. About how the thought of you and Samuel leaving come spring makes me feel like winter will never end." Victoria's heart soared at his words, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "And how do you feel when you look at me?" Hank's laugh was soft and self-deprecating. "Like a man seeing the sunrise for the first time after a lifetime of darkness." The simple poetry of his words brought tears to Victoria's eyes. "I never expected this," she admitted quietly. "After Thomas, I thought I would never trust a man again, never allow myself to feel." "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly," Hank said. "I'm asking for the chance to earn your trust day by day, to show you through actions, not words, that what I feel for you is real." Victoria stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "And what is it that you feel, Hank Forrester?" He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Love," he said simply. "I love you, Victoria. I think I have since the moment I found you in that cave, bringing your son into the world with such courage." Victoria reached up, her hand trembling slightly as she laid it against his bearded cheek. "I love you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." Hank covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss into her palm. "Fear is natural," he said, "but you taught me something, remember. You decide what to feel and then you feel it." Victoria smiled through her tears. "I decide not to be afraid," she echoed her own words from weeks before. "And I decide to love you," Hank replied, "today and every day that you'll allow it." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the meeting of lips. When they parted, Victoria felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, a piece of herself falling into place that she hadn't known was missing. Samuel's soft cry from the cradle broke the moment, and Victoria moved to tend to him, lifting his small, warm body into her arms. Hank followed, standing close enough that his presence enveloped them both, creating a circle of warmth and protection. "He still has a slight fever," Victoria murmured, pressing her lips to Samuel's forehead. "It will break by morning," Hank said with quiet confidence, "and we'll be here together when it does." The promise in those simple words, "we'll be here together," meant more to Victoria than elaborate vows or declarations. It was a promise grounded in the reality they had built together, a commitment to facing whatever came next as one. As February gave way to March, Samuel's health returned fully, and with it came new developments in their relationship. Though Hank continued to sleep on his pallet by the fire out of respect for propriety, their days were filled with small, meaningful touches and moments of tenderness that spoke of their deepening bond. Victoria found herself wondering how long they would maintain this careful distance, and whether Hank would ask the question that seemed to hover unspoken between them. She had resolved not to press, giving him time to find his way to it naturally, but as March progressed and the first signs of spring began to appear, her patience was tested. It was Samuel, indirectly, who finally prompted the conversation they both needed to have. Victoria had taken him outside during a particularly mild afternoon, bundled warmly against the lingering chill but eager to let him experience the fresh air. They sat on a bench Hank had built outside the cabin, watching as he mended fences in the nearby pasture. A passing rider, one of the neighboring ranchers, stopped to exchange news with Hank. Victoria was too far away to hear their conversation, but she saw the man glance her way several times, his expression curious. When he finally rode on, Hank returned to the cabin, his face troubled. "What is it?" Victoria asked, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. Hank sighed, sitting beside her on the bench. That was Jim Prentice. He mentioned that there's been talk in town about us. Victoria's stomach tightened. What kind of talk? The kind you'd expect, Hank said, his tone carefully neutral. A single woman living with a bachelor, a baby with no father listed in the church records. People speculate. Victoria looked down at Samuel, peacefully sleeping in her arms, unaware of the complications of the adult world. Does it bother you, what they're saying? Not for myself, Hank replied honestly, but for you and Samuel. It's not right that you should bear such judgment. Victoria was quiet for a moment, gathering her courage. There's a simple solution to that particular problem, she said finally, not looking at him. Hank turned to face her fully. Victoria, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Now she did meet his eyes, her own steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. That depends on what you think I'm suggesting, Hank Forrester. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. I think you're suggesting I should make an honest woman of you, as they say. And if I were, Victoria challenged, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Hank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn velvet pouch. Then, I'd say I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to ask you properly. Victoria's breath caught as he opened the pouch and tipped a simple gold band into his palm. It was old-fashioned but beautiful, with a small pearl set into the center. It was my mother's, Hank explained, his voice rough with emotion. My father gave it to her when they homesteaded in Kansas, long before I was born. I've kept it all these years, never thinking I'd find someone worthy of wearing it. Tears filled Victoria's eyes as Hank slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding the ring. Victoria Matthews, I love you with a depth that surprises me daily. I love Samuel as if he were my own son. I want to give you both my name, my home, my life, everything I have and everything I am. Will you marry me? Victoria's yes was barely a whisper, but the radiance of her smile needed no words to convey her answer. As Hank slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed like another sign of rightness, Samuel awoke and gazed up at them with wide, curious eyes. Look, Samuel, Victoria said softly, showing him the ring sparkling in the spring sunshine. We're going to be a family, a real family. Hank rose from his knee to sit beside them again, his arm encircling Victoria's shoulders as he leaned down to kiss first her lips, then Samuel's forehead. We already are a family, he corrected gently. Now we're just making it official. They were married 2 weeks later in Pueblo's small church. A simple ceremony with only Dr. Howard, the minister, and Jim Prentice and his wife as witnesses. Victoria wore a new dress of pale blue calico, sewn by her own hands, with Samuel's christening the same day, the infant peaceful in Hank's arms as he was baptized Samuel Matthews Forrester. The gossip that had begun to circulate about them transformed overnight into a different kind of talk admiration for Hank's honorable actions in marrying the young woman he had rescued, approval of Victoria's obvious devotion to both her husband and child, pleasure at the happy ending to what might have been a tragic story. Their return to the ranch that evening marked the beginning of their official life together, though in many ways it was a seamless continuation of what they had already built. The only significant change came that night, when Hank carried Victoria across the threshold of the cabin as tradition demanded, then laid her gently on what was now truly their bed. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a physical expression of the bond that had grown between them over months of shared work, concern, and gradual trust. Victoria, whose only previous experience had been quick and disappointing, found herself awakening to sensations she had never imagined possible, guided by Hank's patient, gentle hands and his whispered words of love and reassurance. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, Victoria marveled at how differently her life had turned out from what she had feared during those desperate hours in the snow. "What are you thinking?" Hank murmured against her hair, his arms tightening around her. "That sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst moments," she replied, tracing lazy patterns on his chest. "If Thomas hadn't betrayed me, if the driver hadn't abandoned me in the snow, if you hadn't heard my screams." If, Hank finished for her. "Too many chances for things to have gone differently." Victoria nodded against his shoulder. "It makes me believe in something greater than chance, guiding us together." "Providence," Hank agreed, kissing her forehead. "And I, for one, am profoundly grateful for it." As spring fully arrived, bringing with it the intense activity of planting, calving, and expanding the small garden plot beside the cabin, Victoria found herself thriving in her new life. The skills she had developed as a matter of survival cooking, sewing, tending animals became sources of pride and accomplishment. Hank taught her to ride, starting with the gentle mare he'd purchased specifically for her use, and soon Victoria was accompanying him on the shorter rounds of the property, Samuel securely wrapped against her chest. Their happiness seemed complete, but Victoria harbored a secret hope that revealed itself one morning in early May as she prepared breakfast. The smell of the frying bacon, normally one of her favorite scents, suddenly turned her stomach, and she barely made it outside before emptying the contents of her stomach behind a lilac bush. Hank found her there moments later, his face creased with concern. "Victoria, are you ill?" She straightened, wiping her mouth with a handkerchief, a small, secretive smile playing at her lips despite her pallor. "Not ill exactly, just hopeful." Understanding dawned in Hank's eyes, replaced quickly by a mixture of joy and concern. "Are you certain?" "Not completely," Victoria admitted, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "But it's been 6 weeks since my monthly time, and this is the third morning I've felt queasy at the smell of cooking meat." Hank's expression softened into wonder as he knelt before her, pressing his ear against her abdomen as if he might hear some confirmation of the tiny life potentially growing there. "Another baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Victoria threaded her fingers through his hair, holding him against her. "A brother or sister for Samuel, God willing." Hank looked up at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have this, Victoria. A wife, children, a real family. Sometimes I wake in the night and reach for you, just to make sure you're real and not some dream I've conjured." Victoria drew him to his feet, wrapping her arms around his waist and laying her head against his chest, where she could hear the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I'm real," she assured him. "We're real, and whatever comes, we'll face it together." By July, there was no doubt about Victoria's condition. Her slender frame had begun to show the gentle curve of early pregnancy, and Dr. Howard confirmed what they already knew during a routine visit to check on Samuel's growth. Unlike her first pregnancy, marked by anxiety and isolation, this one was a time of joy and anticipation. Hank threw himself into preparing for the new arrival with characteristic thoroughness. He added a small bedroom to the cabin, working through the summer heat to have it ready well before the baby's expected arrival in January. Victoria, meanwhile, sewed tiny garments and began putting away preserves for the winter, determined that their first full winter as a family would be one of abundance and comfort. Samuel, now 8 months old and crawling enthusiastically, watched his parents' preparations with bright-eyed curiosity. He had Hank wrapped firmly around his tiny finger, and Victoria often paused in her work to watch them together, Hank showing infinite patience as Samuel pulled himself up on his trouser legs, or babbled incomprehensibly at the ranch cat. "He'll be a good big brother," Hank remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Samuel was asleep on a blanket beside them, one small fist curled under his chin. "He will," Victoria agreed, her hand resting on her growing belly. "And you're a wonderful father to him." Hank's expression turned thoughtful. "I've been meaning to speak with you about that," he said, reaching for her hand. "I'd like to adopt Samuel legally, make him my son in the eyes of the law as well as in my heart. If you're agreeable." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Not for the first time that day, her emotions seemed to overflow at the smallest provocation lately. "Of course I'm agreeable," she said. "I can't think of anything I'd want more. But what about his birth father? Legally, I mean." Hank's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Thomas Bennett, a man he had never met but despised nonetheless for his abandonment of Victoria and Samuel. "From what you've told me, he left no forwarding address, no way to contact him. He's forfeited any right to Samuel, both morally and, I believe, legally." Victoria nodded, relieved. The thought of Thomas suddenly reappearing to claim rights to her son had been a small, persistent fear in the back of her mind. "Then yes, let's make it official. Samuel is your son in every way that matters." The legal adoption process was simpler than either had anticipated, facilitated by the local judge's sympathy for their situation, and the universal respect Hank commanded in the community. By September, Samuel Matthews Forrester was legally Hank's son, a fact they celebrated with a small gathering at the ranch, attended by Dr. Howard, the Prentices, and a few other neighbors who had become friends over the months. As autumn painted the landscape in vibrant hues, and the first frost silvered the meadows, Victoria found herself reflecting on the extraordinary year that had passed from desperation to contentment, from abandonment to belonging. The woman who had staggered through a blizzard, alone and terrified, seemed like a distant memory, though Victoria knew she carried that woman's strength within her still. One crisp October morning, as Victoria sat on the porch shelling the last of the season's peas, a rider appeared on the road leading to their property. She shaded her eyes against the sun, trying to make out who it might be. They weren't expecting visitors, and Hank was in the north pasture, too far to call easily. As the rider drew closer, Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Though she hadn't seen him in over a year, she would recognize that cocky posture, that particular way of sitting a horse, anywhere. Thomas Bennett. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the well-tended garden, and finally settling on Victoria with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to calculation. His eyes dropped to her swollen belly, then darted to Samuel, playing contentedly with wooden blocks at her feet. "Well, well," Thomas said, swinging down from his saddle with the easy grace she remembered all too well. "Victoria Matthews, I hardly expected to find you here." Victoria stood, one hand protectively on Samuel's head. "It's Victoria Forrester now," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" He approached the porch, stopping at the bottom step, his smile sharp and insincere. "I came back to Pueblo on business and heard the most interesting story about a woman I once knew who'd taken up with a rancher named Forrester." Imagine my surprise when I realized who they were talking about. Victoria's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "That doesn't explain why you're here, on our property." Thomas's smile faltered slightly at her emphasis on our. "I thought perhaps we should talk about certain Arrangements. Victoria's blood ran cold as his meaning became clear. There's nothing to arrange. Samuel is my husband's son now, legally adopted. Thomas's eyebrows rose. Husband? Well, you didn't waste any time, did you? And already another brat on the way. His gaze flicked dismissively to her belly. Victoria felt a surge of anger replace her initial fear. You have no right to judge me, Thomas Bennett. You abandoned me when I needed you most. You left me to give birth alone in a blizzard where I nearly died, where Samuel nearly died. Thomas had the grace to look momentarily abashed, but he recovered quickly. I had opportunities in California I couldn't pass up, but I'm back now and I'm willing to be reasonable about the boy. Reasonable, Victoria repeated, incredulous. There's nothing to be reasonable about. You have no claim on him. I'm his father, Thomas said, his voice hardening. Blood counts for something in these parts. Not as much as love and care, came a deep voice from behind him. Thomas whirled to find Hank dismounting from Buck, his expression thunderous as he strode toward the porch. He must have seen the unexpected visitor from the pasture and ridden back immediately. And you must be the husband, Thomas said, sizing Hank up with a sneer that couldn't quite mask his unease. Hank stood several inches taller than Thomas and outweighed him by at least 30 pounds of solid muscle. I'm Samuel's father, Hank corrected, positioning himself between Thomas and the porch steps. His only father as far as the law and God are concerned. Thomas's hand drifted toward his hip, where Victoria could now see he wore a pistol. The law might have something different to say if I choose to contest this. Adoption. Victoria saw Hank's shoulders tense, though his voice remained calm. I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Bennett. Are you threatening me? Thomas challenged, his fingers now resting openly on his pistol grip. No, Hank replied evenly. I'm advising you as one man to another. You gave up any claim to Samuel when you abandoned his mother. You've made your choices and we've made ours. There's nothing for you here. For a tense moment, Victoria feared Thomas might draw his weapon, but something in Hank's steady gaze seemed to dissuade him. Perhaps it was the absolute certainty he saw there, or perhaps it was the realization that Hank, despite not wearing a visible weapon, projected absolute confidence in his ability to handle any threat. Finally, Thomas's hand dropped away from his pistol, and he took a step back. I didn't come here looking for trouble, he said, his tone sulky now. Just wanted to see if there might be some compensation due to me. Compensation. Hank's voice was dangerously quiet. For giving up my rights to the boy officially, Thomas explained, confirming Victoria's suspicion that his interest was purely mercenary. Hank's laugh was without humor. You sold those rights for a mining company advance the day you left Victoria at the train station. There's nothing more to discuss. Thomas glanced at Victoria, then at Samuel, who was watching the exchange with wide, solemn eyes. For a moment, something like regret flashed across his handsome features, quickly replaced by his customary indifference. Fine, he said, turning back to his horse. Keep the brat. I was only trying to do the right thing. No, Victoria called after him, unable to let his last lie stand. You were trying to get money, as always. The right thing would have been staying with me a year ago when I needed you. The right thing would have been being a man instead of a coward. Thomas paused with one foot in the stirrup, his face flushing with anger, but a glance at Hank's unwavering stance seemed to think better of whatever retort he'd been about to make. Instead, he swung into the saddle and reined his horse around. You always were too high and mighty for your own good, Victoria, he called back. Enjoy your little ranch and your settler husband. I've got bigger things waiting for me. They watched in silence as he rode away, the dust from his horses' hooves the only evidence he had been there at all. When he was finally out of sight, Victoria released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her knees suddenly weak as the tension drained from her body. Hank was at her side instantly, his strong arm around her waist as he led her to the rocking chair. "Are you all right?" he asked, kneeling before her, his eyes searching her face. Victoria nodded, pulling Samuel onto her lap and hugging him close. "I'm fine, just—" Shocked to see him after all this time. Hank's expression was grim. "I should have been here. If he tried to harm you or Samuel, but he didn't," Victoria interrupted gently. "And I think we've seen the last of Thomas Bennett. He's not the type to persist when there's no profit in it." Hank nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "Still, I'll ride into town tomorrow, make sure the sheriff knows he's around. And I'll speak with Judge Wilson again about the adoption, make sure everything is ironclad." Victoria touched his cheek, the stubble rough beneath her fingers. "You're a good man, Hank Forrester, the best man I've ever known." The tension in his face softened under her touch. "I just want to protect what's mine," he said simply. "You, Samuel, our baby on the way, you're everything to me." Later that night, after Samuel was asleep and they had retired to their bedroom, Victoria found herself unable to settle despite her exhaustion. She sat at the small vanity Hank had built for her, brushing her long hair and staring at her reflection in the mirror. Hank appeared behind her, his hands gentle as they took the brush from hers and continued the rhythmic strokes. "What's troubling you?" he asked. "Is it Bennett's visit?" Victoria sighed, leaning back against him. "Partly," she admitted. "Seeing him brought back memories I'd rather forget. But also—" She hesitated, unsure how to express the complex emotions swirling within her. "Tell me," Hank encouraged, setting down the brush to massage her shoulders. "Seeing Thomas made me realize how close I came to a life of misery," Victoria said slowly. "If he hadn't abandoned me, I might have married him, never knowing what true partnership could be, never knowing you." Hank's hands stilled on her shoulders. "Providence again," he murmured. Victoria nodded. "But it also made me wonder, what if I'm not the wife you deserve? What if I'm not enough?" Hank turned her gently to face him, his expression incredulous. "Not enough. Victoria, you're more than I ever dared hope for. You've brought life and warmth to a home that was just shelter before you came. You've given me a son and another child on the way. You work alongside me every day as a true partner. How could you possibly think you're not enough?" Victoria blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "I suppose Thomas always made me feel lacking. No matter what I did, it was never quite right, never quite what he wanted." Anger flashed in Hank's eyes. "Then he was a fool as well as a coward," he said firmly. "You, Victoria Forrester, are everything I want and more than I deserve." He pulled her gently to her feet and led her to their bed, laying her down with a tenderness that spoke volumes. As he stretched out beside her, his hand came to rest on the swell of her belly, where their child grew strong and healthy. "This is our life," Hank whispered, his lips close to her ear. "This home, our children, the land we tend together. No ghost from the past can touch what we've built unless we let them." Victoria turned her face to his, finding his lips in the darkness. "I won't let him," she promised. "Not Thomas, not anyone." Their kiss deepened, reaffirming the bond between them that had grown from necessity to friendship to love. As Hank's hands traced the new curves of her changing body with reverence, Victoria felt the last shadows of her encounter with Thomas fade away, replaced by the solid, enduring reality of her life with Hank. Thomas Bennett did not return, though they heard through town gossip that he'd left Pueblo after losing heavily in a poker game at the saloon. Victoria was not surprised. Gambling had always been one of Thomas's weaknesses, along with women and easy money. As winter approached once more, The ranch was prepared as it had not been the previous year. The root cellar was stocked with vegetables, the smokehouse filled with cured meats, the barn snug and warm for the animals. Hank had added weather stripping to the cabin doors and windows, determined that this winter would find his family comfortable and secure. Victoria's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body stronger this time and supported by proper nutrition and care. Dr. Howard visited monthly, pronouncing her in excellent health and predicting an easier birth than she had experienced with Samuel. "Though perhaps we should plan for me to stay nearby as your time approaches," the elderly doctor suggested during his December visit, eyeing the heavy snow clouds gathering on the horizon. "Given your history with winter deliveries." Victoria laughed, cradling her prominent belly. "I think that would be wise. This little one seems eager to follow in his brother's footsteps as a child of the snow." "His?" Hank questioned, raising an eyebrow. "Are you so certain it's a boy?" Victoria smiled mysteriously. "Just a feeling. A mother knows these things." Samuel, now a sturdy toddler of 1 year, watched the doctor's examination with interest from his father's lap. His vocabulary had expanded to include mama, papa, and a variety of animal sounds, much to Hank's delight and pride. As the first anniversary of their meeting approached, Victoria found herself reflecting on how much had changed in a single year. The date itself, December 15, dawned bright and clear, the sun glinting off fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Hank had insisted Victoria rest while he handled the morning chores, so she sat by the window with Samuel, pointing out birds and teaching him their names. When Hank returned, stamping snow from his boots at the door, his cheeks were ruddy with cold and his eyes bright with excitement. "I have a surprise for you," he announced, holding out his hand to help her up from the chair. "What kind of surprise?" Victoria asked, intrigued by his boyish enthusiasm. "Put on your coat and come see," Hank replied, already helping Samuel into his tiny fur-lined jacket. Curious, Victoria allowed Hank to wrap her in her warmest cloak and guide her outside. There in the yard stood a brand-new sleigh, polished pine runners gleaming in the sunlight, and a comfortable seat lined with thick fur blankets. "Hank," Victoria gasped, delighted. "When did you do this?" "I've been working on it in the barn after you go to sleep," he admitted, pleased by her reaction. "Jim Prentice helped with the metalwork. I thought we could take a ride to commemorate the day if you're feeling up to it." Victoria's heart swelled with love for this man who continuously found ways to surprise and delight her. "It's perfect," she said, reaching up to kiss his cold, reddened cheek. "I'd love a ride." Hank helped her into the sleigh, tucking blankets around her and Samuel before hitching Buck to the front. The gelding seemed pleased with his new role, prancing in place until Hank took the reins and guided him onto the packed snow of the trail. The day was crisp and still, the recent snow clinging to pine branches and transforming the landscape into a wonderland of white. Victoria held Samuel securely on her lap, pointing out deer tracks and red feathered cardinals as they glided along. Hank's arm was warm and solid around her shoulders, and despite the cold, Victoria felt a glow of contentment that radiated from somewhere deep within. They followed the trail down into the valley, eventually reaching the spot where Hank had found her a year earlier. The shallow cave looked smaller in daylight than Victoria remembered, half hidden by a snowdrift and unexceptional in appearance. Hank reined Buck to a stop, his expression solemn as he gazed at the place where their story had begun. "I still dream about it sometimes," he admitted quietly. "Finding you there, seeing Samuel born, I wake up in a cold sweat, afraid I was too late." Victoria leaned against him, understanding completely. "I dream of it too," she said. "But in my dreams I'm not afraid anymore, because I know you'll come." Hank turned to her, his eyes suspiciously bright in the winter sunlight. "I will always come for you, Victoria. Wherever you are, whatever you need." They might have sat there longer, lost in memory and emotion, if Samuel hadn't chosen that moment to announce loudly that he was hungry, pointing imperiously at the basket Hank had packed with lunch. Their laughter broke the spell of the moment, returning them to the joyful present. They ate their simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples in the sleigh, surrounded by blankets and warmed by each other's presence. As Hank guided the sleigh back toward home, Victoria felt the first twinge low in her belly, a familiar tightening that made her breath catch. She said nothing, not wanting to alarm Hank unnecessarily. It could be a false alarm, after all. She still had nearly 2 weeks until her expected delivery date. But by the time they reached the cabin, the pains had increased in both frequency and intensity, leaving little doubt in Victoria's mind about what was happening. "Hank," she said calmly as he helped her down from the sleigh, "I think you should get Samuel settled for his nap and then ride for Doctor Howard." Hank's eyes widened as he took in her meaning, his gaze dropping to her belly and then back to her face. "The baby's coming now," Victoria nodded, smiling despite another contraction beginning to build. "It seems our little one has a sense of occasion. What better day to join us than the anniversary of when we became a family?" Hank's momentary panic subsided into efficient action. He helped Victoria into the cabin and settled her comfortably on their bed before putting a sleepy Samuel down for his nap. Then he knelt beside her, his face serious. "I don't want to leave you," he said, taking her hand. "What if the labor progresses quickly like with Samuel?" Victoria squeezed his fingers reassuringly. "This is different. I'm not alone in a cave during a blizzard. I'm warm, safe, and the contractions are still quite far apart. There's plenty of time for you to fetch the doctor." Hank still hesitated, torn between staying with his wife and ensuring she had proper medical care. "If you're certain—" "I am," Victoria assured him. "Go now while there's still good daylight. I promise I won't have this baby until you're back with Dr. Howard." Hank pressed a kiss to her forehead before rising. "I'll be as quick as humanly possible," he promised, already reaching for his coat. "And Victoria, I love you, more than I have words to express." "I love you too," she replied, her smile radiant despite the discomfort of another contraction beginning. "Now go, so you can be here to meet your daughter." "Daughter?" Hank paused at the door, his eyebrows rising. "I thought you were certain it was a boy." Victoria's laugh was interrupted by a grimace as the contraction peaked. "A mother's prerogative to change her mind," she managed, waving him out the door. "Hurry back." Hank's journey to town and back with Dr. Howard was accomplished in record time, the sleigh allowing for faster travel than horseback through the snowy terrain. They arrived to find Victoria still laboring, her pains now regular and strong but her spirit undimmed. "You certainly have a flair for dramatic timing, Mrs. Forrester," Dr. Howard commented dryly as he washed his hands in the basin Hank had prepared. "Though I must say, these accommodations are a significant improvement over your last delivery setting." Victoria's laugh turned into a groan as another contraction seized her. "Less talking, more delivering, if you please, Doctor." Unlike Samuel's precipitous birth, this labor progressed steadily over several hours. Hank remained at Victoria's side throughout, wiping her brow with cool cloths, supporting her back when she needed to change positions, and murmuring constant words of encouragement and love. Samuel woke from his nap during the process and was momentarily distressed by his mother's obvious pain. But Hank calmly explained that Mama was working very hard to bring his new brother or sister into the world. The toddler seemed to accept this explanation, settling on Hank's lap to wait with surprising patience. As the winter sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold, Victoria gave a final, powerful push, and their daughter slipped into the waiting hands of Dr. Howard. Her lusty cry filled the cabin as the doctor quickly cleaned her airway and wrapped her in a warm blanket. "You have a beautiful, healthy daughter," he announced, placing the tiny bundle in Victoria's eager arms. Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she gazed at her daughter for the first time. Unlike Samuel, who had been born with a shock of dark hair like his birth father, this infant had wispy reddish-gold curls that promised to match Hank's auburn hair. "She's perfect," Victoria whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes with a mother's instinctive thoroughness. "Absolutely perfect." Hank, his own eyes suspiciously damp, perched on the edge of the bed with Samuel to admire their newest family member. "She looks like you," he said, gently touching the baby's petal soft cheek. "She has your nose." Dr. Howard completed his examination of both mother and child, pronouncing them in excellent health. "I'll stay the night to be sure all remains well," he said, packing away his instruments, "but I don't anticipate any complications." As darkness fell and the cabin grew quiet, with Samuel asleep in his bed and Dr. Howard dozing in the rocking chair by the fire, Victoria and Hank lay side by side on their bed, their newborn daughter nestled between them. "What shall we name her?" Hank asked, his finger caught in the surprisingly strong grip of his daughter's tiny hand. Victoria smiled, exhausted but radiant with happiness. "I was thinking of Elizabeth after your mother, Elizabeth Hope Forrester." Hank's throat tightened with emotion at the mention of his mother who had died when he was 15. "Elizabeth Hope," he repeated softly. "It's perfect." A name with history and promise. Victoria reached across their daughter to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his beard. "1 year ago today, I thought my life was ending. I was alone in pain, certain that Samuel and I would die in that cave. And I was sitting alone in my cabin, listening to the wind and feeling like something was missing from my life, though I couldn't have named what it was," Hank added. "Now look at us," Victoria marveled, her gaze taking in their daughter, the comfortable room, and the man who had become the center of her world. "A family, a home, a future." Hank leaned carefully across Elizabeth to kiss his wife, his lips gentle against hers. "A miracle," he corrected softly. "Our miracle, begun in the snow." Outside, fresh snowflakes began to fall, dancing in the glow from the cabin windows before settling gently on the ground, covering the tracks of the past and creating a clean, white slate for the future, just as a desperate cry in the wilderness had led to a new beginning for Victoria and Hank Forrester. A love story written in snow and sealed with the birth of their children. As Elizabeth and Samuel slept peacefully, Hank and Victoria held each other close, their hearts full with the knowledge that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest dawns, and that love, once found, can warm even the coldest night.